When you think of the name Alexander, immediately you think of the Great, Alexander the Great. Such is the narrative that has been built, and we who are unfortunate products of a British education system believe this, Alexander the Great. But this Alexander who attacked our country, how can he be great for us? It is the same thing as saying that how can we consider both Akbar and Maharana Pratap as great? So how can Alexander be great for us? He was just an invader like so many of the other ones. So I thought that in this episode we'll explore the whole story of Alexander's attack on India, what happened during it and after it. And for this purpose, I am going to read you an excerpt from this excellent book called The Six Glorious Epochs of Indian History, written by Veer Savarkar, who, apart from being a revolutionary, apart from being an astute politician and an expert of geopolitical matters, was also an excellent writer. In fact, one of the things that is not often spoken about is his mastery on language, his extremely deep knowledge of history, and his beautiful and evocative style of writing. So today, let's dive into this ancient event of our history as written by Veer Savarkar. Alexander's attack on India is the first well-known foreign invasion during the ancient period of Indian history. It took place in 326 BC, a period of human history when the modern European nations, like England, France, Germany, and others were not even born. The Roman Empire had not, as yet, any foundation laid for it. It was only the Greeks who were resounding the European stage. Small Greek city-states ruled themselves independently. Of these, Sparta and Athens were the most progressive. But when these small separate city-states were invaded by the ruler of a vast, well-organized, and very powerful Persian Empire, they were unable to face him successfully. Those small Greek republics did their best to fight the enemy back, but all their efforts proved fruitless before the vast ocean-like Persian armies. Naturally, the Greeks earnestly thought of effecting a fusion of all their separated small city-states into a powerful Greek kingdom and forming a united front. So Philip, king of Macedonia, who was fired with the same ambition, conquered all those small Greek republics. But he died before he could develop them into a mighty nation. But his son, who succeeded him to the throne, was much more ambitious, much more eager to gain power than his father, whom he surpassed in valor. He was Alexander. He inspired the whole Greek community with a sense of solidarity and militant nationalism. He organized an invincible army and marched on the Persian emperor, Darius, who had been the archenemy of the Greeks. With his victorious army, Alexander marched straight on to the Persian capital, and after conquering it, he proclaimed himself the emperor of that country. This unprecedented success whetted his lust for conquests. With the Greek and the Persian empires at his feet, the sky seemed to him well within his limit. He was intoxicated with the wild ambition to conquer the whole world, and therefore he planned to invade India, of which the Greeks had been hearing so much for generations together. He thought he would run over India as easily as he had crushed the Persian as well as the ancient Babylonian Empire. In order to execute this daring plan, he formed a new powerful army with a pick of his Greek soldiers, full of youthful enthusiasm and equipped it with glittering weapons. This army consisted of 120,000 foot soldiers and a cavalry 15,000 strong. These brave soldiers, mad with victory after victory, had been so impressed by the unbroken chain of Alexander's conquests that they looked upon this great general and emperor as a divine being. Alexander himself began to pose as the son of the Greek god Zeus. In those days, the Indian community and Indian kingdoms had spread far beyond the Indus, right up to the boundary of Persia. The mountain range known today as the Hindu Kush was at that time called Paropnesus by the Greeks. Modern Afghanistan was called Gandhar, known in Indian tradition by the name Ahighanistan, while the river Kabul has been called Kubha in our ancient literature. Throughout the whole region up to the Hindu Kush mountains ruled peacefully various states, some small, some large. Right from these Indian states all along the banks of the Indus, straight up to the place where it leaps into the sea, was a long and unbroken chain of Indian states, which strictly followed the Vedic religion. Most of them were republics and were then called Ganas or Ganrajyas. Their constitution was democratic. There were only 2 or 3 monarchies worth the name, one of which, the biggest and the strongest, was ruled by a Paurav king, whom the Greeks called Porus. According to Greek mythologies, they seem to have believed that their ancestors had migrated as a separate branch of the original Aryan people from Gandhar and other regions beyond the Indus. Alexander too was led to believe that India must be the original abode of his ancestors. He and his whole army was so delighted at the sight of this, their antique fatherland, that they stopped fighting for some days and celebrated a great festival. Because the Greek gods resembled the Vedic ones very closely. Their names had undergone changes in pronunciation by corruption during the course of time. The Greeks too performed sacrifices, as the Vedic people did, and offered oblations through the fire to the various deities. They were also called Ionians. It is likely that these Greeks were the descendants of Anu, the son of Yayati. The Indians called these Greeks Yavanas from the very beginning, as is seen from the Sanskrit literature. The eastern boundary of Alexander's empire at that time was the Hindu Kush mountains. After having crossed these mountains, he marched with his vast armies straight to Takshila in India. The king of Takshila, King Ambuj or Ambhi, accepted his overlordship without giving him any battle. Takshila was the seat of the most famous Indian university of the time, where students from different countries came to study various sciences and arts. By some strange coincidence, just when Alexander was marching at the head of this army into India, a brilliant youth, who a little later was destined to carve a glorious page in the history of India, was learning the sciences of war and politics in the same university of Takshila. His name was Chandragupta. The old teacher, who was well versed in different lores of the time and was also an astute politician and was giving lessons in politics and national revolutionary activities to this splendid youth, was Chanakya. Both of them had been watching very closely the movements of Alexander's vast forces. Alexander had, as it were, put all the crowns and coronets of kings and all the small raos and ravels into a melting pot and forged a single crown to proclaim himself the emperor of India, while the old sage, Acharya Chanakya, was secretly planning an easy transfer of that covetable crown to his young disciple's head by means of a coup d'etat. The king of Takshila, Ambuj or Ambhi, had bowed down to the Greek might without fighting a single battle, and therefore everybody began to jeer at his treacherous act as it humiliated their brave spirits. In order to counteract it, the neighboring Indian monarchies and republics decided to force a bitter struggle on the Greeks. As soon as he reached Takshila, Alexander, without any loss of time, sent ultimatum to all the neighboring Indian states, demanding unconditional surrender. And when Takshila's very next neighbor, King Porus, ignored his ultimatum and took up the challenge, the Greek captain general marched on him. King Porus mainly depended on his war chariots and elephants, whereas the Greeks relied upon their cavalry brigades. The river Jhelum separated the two armies. All of a sudden, even before the two armies joined the battle, torrential rains overflowing the river with high floods began to assail them all around. Alexander searched high and low and in a few days found to the north a place where the river was fordable. With precipitate haste, he crossed the river and with his fine cavalry dashed against the forces of King Porus. This disturbed the whole plan of Porus. Still, he fought a fierce battle. But the rains had turned the field muddy, rendering utterly useless King Porus's two great instruments of war, chariots and elephants. He could not, therefore, successfully check the brisk and energetic attacks of Alexander's horsemen. In the thick of the battle, Porus, seated on his elephant and desperately fighting, was grievously wounded and fell into the hands of the enemy. Alexander knew that if he killed Porus or liquidated his kingdom, the high-minded people of the state would be aflame with rage and hatred towards the Greeks. Now Alexander wanted to fight his way all along to the chief capital of India, Patliputra. Could he ever do so with the sole support of his own Greek army? On the other hand, it was far more profitable for him to win over Porus with kindness, as he had done to King Ambhi of Takshila, and enlist his active support in order to facilitate the accomplishment of his daring plan of the conquest of India. It is therefore not for the sake of appreciating Porus, but as a clever political strategy, that Alexander returned to Porus his kingdom. Porus too gave his assent to Alexander's proposal to simply wait for his time, for fortune had played foul with him. Porus had done his duty, as a Kshatriya warrior would do, of fighting till the end against the enemy of his nation. The scouts whom Alexander had sent around to survey the local condition of the people in the subjugated as well as the non-subjugated provinces brought, among other reports, detailed descriptions of ascetics, anchorites, recluses freed from all worldly bonds, wandering about alone in search of knowledge, and also of those sages who were deeply engrossed in philosophical thought. Alexander had already heard much in Greece about such ascetics and of the austere Brahmins, so he earnestly desired to see personally at least some of these Brahmins in India and have talks with them. So he sent for some of them from their forest abodes, and some he saw in their secluded cells. Alexander keenly felt that he should send for and have a personal talk with one Brahmin, of whom he had heard so much in Takshila. The Greeks called this Brahmin Dandamis. The Brahmin, bent with age and knowledge, was free from all worldly ties and wandered naked everywhere. He did not pay heed to Alexander's messages. Thereupon Alexander sent his own officer to this selfless recluse, who told him, "Alexander, the very son of God Zeus and a world conqueror, has summoned you to his court. If you still fail to come, you will be beheaded instantaneously." The Brahmin began to laugh at this threat and replied, "If Alexander is the son of Zeus, in the same manner and for the same reason, I am also the son of that very Zeus. As to his boast of being a world conqueror, it is absolutely vain. For he has not as yet seen the other bank of the river Vyas. If he successfully faces the brave Indian states beyond, and yonder still the powerful empire of Magad, and still remain alive, we shall have time to consider whether he is a world conqueror. Alexander offers me land and gold, but go and tell him that ascetics like me spit upon such things. This motherland of mine provides me with everything I want, with the loving care of a real mother. If Alexander is going to chop my head off, then my head and body would mix up with this earth of which they are made. But he would never be able to murder my soul. It is invincible, indestructible, and immortal. Go and tell him that he should issue these threats to those who are slaves of gold and power and are afraid of death. Before us, these threats of a mortal like Alexander fall flat and are powerless. For a true ascetic Brahmin can never be won over by gold, nor does he ever fear death. I won't come. Go away." Some writers, astounded by his dauntless and straightforward answer, have remarked, if at all anyone in the world has so successfully defied Alexander, who had conquered so many kingdoms, it was this naked old Brahmin ascetic of India. In his survey, Alexander came to know that although these world-forsakers, ascetics, recluses and others were wandering all alone, their opinions exerted a powerful influence because of their disinterestedness, fearlessness and their disregard for any consequences whatsoever upon the governments of Indian republics and also on the monarchies. The tongues of these free and fearless Brahmin ascetics had sharp edges like the swords of the Indian Kshatriyas, and they protested against the unjust Greek aggression very sharply, and spread, openly or secretly, great discontent against Alexander amongst the Indian populace. Thereupon he began to seize some such Brahmins and hang them. Before beheading one such Brahmin, when Alexander asked him as to why he instigated a certain Indian ruler against the Greeks, he fearlessly and firmly replied that it was his most sacred tenet, and that if he were to live, he ought to live honorably, else he should die honorably. After defeating King Porus, Alexander thought that this dazzling victory would unnerve the neighboring states and force them to submit meekly. But his hopes in this respect belied him. As he crossed the Jhelum and marched onwards, the various republics, big or small, began to offer him battles. Without a decision at the battlefield, they would never accept his overlordship. Although the superior number and might of the Greeks went on overpowering the Indians, the consequent strain of incessant fighting did not fail to make itself felt on the Greeks. A good many republics in the Panchanad, that is the Punjab, and along both the banks of the Indus, right up to its great leap into the sea, was said to be living on weapons. The most remarkable fact about them was that not only the men but the women too in those republics had necessarily to undergo military training, so that at the time of war, literally the whole nation could be drafted for military action. Although different from each other in some particular respects, their constitutions, needless to say, were essentially democratic. Whether big in size or small, they were all independent. The Republic of the Yodhayas, spread far and wide in the fertile lands to the south of the river Vyas in the Panchanad, was the most prominent of them all. It was looked upon with awe and respect by everyone because of its valiant youths who always fought for their independence, regardless of their lives. It was truly called a nation in arms. They had a law necessitating everyone between the ages of 18 and 21 to undergo sound military training, which kept not only their male but even the female population well equipped with arms. On seeing Alexander march down the Jhelum and the Chenab, after defeating King Porus, the adjoining republics and the hill tribes, the gallant Yodhayas, who were to the south of the river, spurned Alexander's ultimatum of abject surrender and began all-out preparations for war. Yet the so-called Emperor of Magad, the cowardly Dhananand, was not roused from his stupor. That coward did not send any military help to the gallant Yodhayas in order to vanquish Alexander at the very portals of India. Nevertheless, the Yodhayas got ready to face Alexander, relying on nothing but their own strength. When Alexander's army came fighting to the banks of the river Vyas, they came to know that beyond that river, the democratic Yodhayas had taken arms to fight for their independence against the Greeks. Besides, they learnt about their bravery and also of the fact that beyond the Yodhayas, mightier Indian states along the banks of the Ganga were making ready to fight with them. Though the Greek soldiers, already spent and disgusted with unceasing warfare with the Indians in the Panchanad, dared not cross the Vyas and join battle with the courageous and daring Indian states like the Yodhayas and the others. But the lust for war and conquest of their war-intoxicated, enterprising and exceptionally courageous captain, general and emperor Alexander was not quenched in the least. He proclaimed throughout all the divisions of his army his immutable decision to cross the Vyas, conquer the Yodhayas, and march straight to Magad. This obstinate declaration of Alexander roused a great furor and rage amongst the already war-weary army, even amongst the veterans. The Greek soldiers secretly began to pass resolutions, group by group, to refuse straightaway to go ahead. In spite of the fact that they had been considering Alexander unconquerable and the son of god Zeus, they were extremely disgusted with his lust for power. No sooner did Alexander smell of this dissatisfaction amongst his soldiers that he delivered an inspiring speech. He recited the glories of their wondrous conquests and promised them dominion and the riches of all Asia. But glowing words fell on unwilling ears and were received with painful silence, which remained unbroken for a long time. The Greek army refused to move an inch forward against the nation whose very name, according to Alexander, struck his soldiers with terror. Alexander was extremely enraged to see that his soldiers disobeyed him by flatly refusing to cross the Vyas because they were afraid and thoroughly exhausted without any rest. But Alexander was as cunning as he was brave. Apprehending danger, Alexander refrained from doing anything rash in a fit of anger and straightway walked off into his tent in utter despair. He stopped talking to anybody. He did not show himself outside his tent for 3 consecutive days. Then he thoughtfully hashed a new plan in his mind. He therefore gathered the whole of the Greek army and told them that he had given up the plan of crossing the Vyas. He said, "I have now decided to go back to Greece." This statement naturally elated the rank and file of his army. Alexander then asked, "But how are we to go back? If we turn our backs straight away and go to Greece by the same route as we came along, all these Indian territory we have conquered would rise in revolt, thinking that we are stricken with terror. So instead of turning our back straight off towards the land route to Greece, we should better go a little obliquely to the sea along the banks of the Indus, and then return to Persia along the sea route. Next time, when we shall come again to India, we shall conquer the Indian states beyond the Ganga and accomplish our conquest of India." However loudly and pompously Alexander might have swaggered with his mouth, the fact remains that the Greek soldiers took a fright of the Yodhayas and others beyond the Vyas, and hence Alexander could not dare cross that river. Indian valor had taken the conceit out of the haughty spirit of the advancing Greek army, and so they had to strike a retreat. Alexander did not retire willingly. the Greeks proved to be powerless before the Indians, and hence was this ignoble retreat. To hide this simple fact, the Greek and European historians write, had he but crossed the Vyas, Alexander would have defeated not only the Yodhayas, but the Magad Empire also. The Yodhayas and the Magads have never actually defeated the Greek army of Alexander on the open battlefield. These boastful ifs and whens can be answered most aptly on behalf of the valorous Indian Yodhayas through a shlok of Mahakavi Kalidas from Abhigyan Shakuntalam, Act 3, Shlok 1. Ka khatha baan sanghane, ja shabdanesh durtah, hukkanadeva dhanushah, sahi vidnanya pohati, which means, why fight with an enemy who flees away at the mere twang of our bow? Soon after his retreat from the Vyas, Alexander had 500 to 600 warships built in order to make his way to the sea along the course of the Indus. But while Alexander was making his way towards the sea, a very great political conspiracy began to shape itself most secretly throughout the Greek-trodden Indian territory from the bank of the Vyas right up to Gandhar. The Indian republics along both the banks of the Indus, whether big or small, made light of Alexander's threat to come again to conquer India as nothing more than a pompous political stunt, and prepared grimly to oppose his forces as severely and as stubbornly as possible. But alas, it was a decision taken separately by each particular republic. It was not a well-organized united effort under a central authority to destroy the Greeks under Alexander. Hence the same story of Gandhar and Panchanad was repeated here, and the well-organized army of Alexander with its superior numbers could successfully fight each Indian republic and go ahead. Even if these stray battles with various Indian armies did not fail to exhaust and weaken Alexander's forces, still they could not crush him completely. There were, of course, some exceptions to these separatist war efforts. The two most prominent ones were the republics of the Malvas and the Shudrakas. The two republics led their separate lives along the banks of the Indus. Both were rich, brave democracies with a high sense of honor. Of the two, the Malva Republic was the more famous from the ancient times and was quite extensive. These two republics had at times been hostile to each other, but when they saw Alexander's powerful navy went on defeating every single Indian state in various battles and kept on forging its way to the sea, the political leaders of both these republics decided to correct the mistake of these several Indian democracies which fought singly with a vastly superior army, a mistake which was proving fatal to their wider national interests. So instead of fighting the Greek army singly, they decided to amalgamate their fighting forces under a unified control. Not only did they unite their men-at-arms, but they intermarried in order to bring about political and social unity among them. While this unified army of the Malva Shudraka republics was fighting tooth and nail with the Greeks, Alexander laid siege to one of their important cities. But as this brave democratic city kept on fighting desperately, the Greek siege had to be prolonged. The haughty Alexander could not bear it. He thought of ordering the ladders to be put up on the ramparts of the enemy's stronghold and commanding his Greek soldiers to climb them up and straightway storm the city. But the same sort of unrest and disaffection against Alexander began to be seen in his army, as was once experienced at the time of the crossing of the Vyas. The Greek army was wending its way homeward in order to avoid new wars, but all along the banks of the Indus they had to fight so many fresh battles. And they knew that unless Alexander gave up his aggressive designs, calculated to pacify his insatiable lust for conquests, brutal wars were unavoidable. Because of this bitter war with the Malva Shudraka's combined forces, the Greek discontent reached the climax, and there were rebellious whispers openly flouting Alexander's commands. When the Macedonian soldiers found that they had still on their hand a fresh war, that the most warlike nations would be their antagonists, they were struck with terror and began again to upbraid the king in the language of sedition. Seeing that his Greek soldiers hesitated to undertake the daring feat, that exceptionally valiant commander of the Greeks, the mighty Alexander himself, began to climb one of the ladders put up against the ramparts of the stronghold. At this, the whole Macedonian army was suddenly inspired to do this great deed, and all of them began to climb the ladders to the stronghold together. Once at the top of the ramparts, Alexander straightway jumped down in the midst of the enemy, and there ensued a hand-to-hand fight between the Indians and the Greek forces. But suddenly, an Indian warrior took out an envenomed arrow from his sheath and applied it to his bowstring and let it fly with an unmistakable aim at the place where Alexander stood, edging on his warriors and shining in his golden helmet. It was not just an arrow. It was, in fact, the Indian revenge incarnate. The shaft of the Indian warrior unmistakably pierced the heart of Alexander, and suddenly the emperor rolled down, unconscious. A Greek soldier immediately covered him with his shield. There was a sudden hue and cry in the Greek ranks that Alexander had been wounded, that he had fallen unconscious. With exceptional daring, the Greeks lifted him from the pool of blood and carried him safely to his camp. There, with great difficulty, the terrible shaft of the Indian warrior was extricated. The Greeks heaved a sigh of relief when, after a long time of patient nursing, Alexander gradually regained consciousness. It took several days for the wound to heal up. During all this time, Alexander was confined to bed. But everywhere in Babylon and Greece, the news that was received reported that Alexander was killed in the war by an Indian arrow. Consequently, there were some uprisings in Gandhar and Persia. The news of Alexander's having fainted by a bowshot was greeted cheerfully throughout the Malwa Shudraka Republic. Alexander was so much puffed up with pride when King Paurav was wounded in the battle that he circulated a new coin with a picture showing his fall stamped on it. That insult inflicted on India was fully avenged by the Indian arrow, which sent the Greek emperor rolling down on the battlefield in pools of blood. The Ionian emperor, Alexander, who unjustifiably shed Indian blood, was made to atone for it personally by the shedding of his own blood. According to his cruel military code, he had been cruelly crushing down the states which had opposed him. But whenever there appeared any foe who was equally strong and who retaliated furiously, Alexander had the cunning to dissemble nobility and frankness of heart. When he recovered from his wound, he began to make overtures of peace to the commanders of the Malwa Shudraka army, instead of dictating his usual arrogant terms. For ceasefire talks, 100 representatives of the joint Malwa Shudraka Republic were elected, and for them Alexander held a grand reception ceremony in his camp. The 100 representatives were, even according to the Greek standards, of uncommon height, heavily built, having handsome muscular bodies. They were clad in valuable embroidered clothes and had worn beautiful ornaments of gold and pearls and precious stones. Every one of them went to the Greek camp in his well-decorated and well-equipped golden chariot. They had with them elephants too, with costly and beautiful outfits. The Greeks had always felt a special fascination for the elephants. Although ranking in his mind was the fact that these very representatives of the Malwa Shudraka joint republic had brought upon him a little while ago a mortal danger, Alexander showed his magnanimity in that reception ceremony and paraded his own imperial splendor. For every one of those 100 representatives, there was a special golden seat. The banquet, which was given in their honor, was attended with costly wines and excellent savory dishes. The grand banquet was followed by various field games and tournaments, music and dancing. In the end, a treaty was signed by the Malwa Shudraka representatives and Alexander. The Greeks and the Indians had jointly agreed to put a stop to their hostilities, and that the Malwa Shudraka Republic was not to cause any harassment to the retreating army of Alexander while it was progressing on its way home along the Indus. But at Masaga, Alexander captured a small armed community of 7,000, which included several women. Alexander promised them their lives on condition that they should join his army and fight with his Indian enemies, or else he threatened them with wholesale manslaughter. Or as a third alternative, he said he would carry them off as slaves. The leaders of the community agreed to his first proposal, but requested that they should be allowed one night for mutual exchange of views. Alexander agreed. Thereupon these 7,000 Indians marched towards a hill some 9 miles ahead of the Greek camp. Historian Vincent Smith writes, "The Indians, being unwilling to aid the foreigners in the subjugation of their countrymen, desired to evade the unwelcome obligation. So they decided to give the slip to the Greeks. But Alexander came to know of their intention. So while they were sleeping for a little rest, Alexander fell upon them all of a sudden with his huge army and began to cut down everyone. There was a great havoc among these Indians. But within a short time, they drew up their swords and other weapons. They made a hollow circular formation, gathering the women and the children inside it, and faced the Greek attack most heroically. A good many women also were found desperately fighting with the foe. Till almost all of them were killed, they kept on fighting for the freedom of their nation. The little Indian Republic of the Agrashrenis too, instead of surrendering, fought to the last, with the vast Greek navy of Alexander as it was making its headway to the seas through the course of the Indus. When the Greeks attacked their very capital, these brave Indian warriors erected blockades and barricades at different intervals and fought every inch of the ground so tenaciously that Alexander could not enter the city before he had sacrificed many Greek lives. According to Curtius, when those brave fellows could not further resist the odds, they set their houses on fire, and their wives and children, and all threw themselves into the flames. That is to say, that they committed Johar. After fighting to the last, when every hope of success was over, when every chance of escape from the enemy was lost, this Johar, this noblest type of self-sacrifice, was resorted to by the Hindus as the last unfailing weapon to save their religion, their nation, their own self-respect, and to avoid captivity, abject slavery, and hateful conversion. This Johar, by the Agrashrenis, is one of the many described by the astounded Greek writers, and which the Indians preferred to the humiliation of being the captives of the Greeks. At last, when Alexander's naval forces reached the mouth of the Indus, fighting incessantly all the way, it met with the yet other independent republics. These Janapadas were like the small Greek city-states, but had none amongst them which could ably withstand with equal numbers the mighty and numerous army of Alexander. Still one of them, the Brahmanak Janpad, made up its mind to cross swords with rather than submit to Alexander. It is already told how, while fighting in the Panchanad, or the Punjab, Alexander had unleashed his rancorous revenge against the clan of the philosophers, especially the Brahmins. When Alexander learned that it was the same clan of Brahmins to which this small state belonged, he decided to whack his malicious stroke upon it with all his might. Plutarch writes in his book The Life of Alexander that these philosophers were specially marked down for revenge by Alexander, as they gave him no less trouble than the mercenaries. They reviled the princes who declared for Alexander and encouraged free states in India to revolt against his authority. On his account, Alexander hanged many of them. That little Janpad too fought to the last with the Greeks for the sake of its national honor and independence. Upon first reaching the sea, Alexander divided his army into two parts. The first batch he sent back to Iran, Persia, by a land route through what now goes by the name of Balochistan. The whole of Alexander's army had been thoroughly exhausted in this expedition to India. Moreover, Balochistan at that time was full of impregnable forests and thoroughly unknown to the Greeks. So the Greek division sent this way somehow reached Persia after so many hazards and privations. On the other hand, Alexander himself set sail by the sea route with another division of his army and reached Persia. As the whole of the old Persian Empire had now formed a part of Alexander's great domain, he went to his capital named Babylon. But he did not return to the capital in the same triumphant spirit in which he had started on his Indian campaign 2 years ago, with a view of winning for himself the title of the Emperor of India. Not only did he not return like the Emperor of India, he did not even appear to be an emperor at all. He returned just like an ordinary commander of an army, despaired and worn out after a long-drawn and hazardous campaign. The cause of this disappointment of Alexander was that the Greeks, up to that time, knew only one empire worth the name, that of Persia. When these Greeks marched upon that Persian empire under their uncommonly brave and brilliant commander Alexander, and when after only 2 or 3 campaigns the vast Persian empire fell before them like a paper palace, they were so much flushed with their victory that they fondly considered their commander to be endowed with divine qualities and deemed him unconquerable. Alexander himself could not escape the infection of pride. His ambition to win for himself the overlordship of the whole world soared to the sky. Bharat appeared to him just next to and as easy a prey as Persia, so he wanted to crown his Persian conquest with the glittering diadem of the Indian imperial authority. But the experience he had was quite contrary to what he had expected. In India, he had to face the bitterest opposition at every step. These victories were far too costlier than the ones in Persia, and all their vauntful declarations of conquering India as easily as Persia proved to be empty words, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And in the end, he had to return with the acquisition of only a small strip of land along the Indus River. Thus was Alexander disappointed and to a certain extent insulted. But that valiant emperor was not downcast. He was itching to return once again to India after stabilizing things in the newly conquered regions of India and annexing them permanently to his vast empire, like those of Syria, Persia, Babylon and others. Before Alexander decided to stabilize things in the Indian territory he had recently captured, he learned that the local democratic institutions refused to accept his overlordship. Even while Alexander was in Sindh, he received intelligence of a revolt by the Indian subjects in Kandahar. He was about to send a fresh and large Greek army to Kandahar, but in quick succession followed another disturbing news of a fresh conspiracy being hatched in the Punjab, the Panchnath, to overthrow Alexander completely. But Alexander could at that time do nothing to thwart any such attempts at revolt. During his campaign against India, not only his army, but he himself was completely exhausted. To add to it, his addiction to drinking had grown beyond all limits of safety, and he suddenly took ill and died in 323 BCE. That is to say, hardly within a year and a half of his return from India, with all his army, the great Greek emperor breathed his last at Babylon. As has already been told, as soon as Alexander began to retreat along the Indus, some of the Indian politicians began hatching out a secret plan against the Greeks in the Punjab to win back their lost freedom. But it was not merely aimed at the recovery of the lost territory. It was essentially to overhaul and revolutionize the whole gamut of the political life of India and to bring about a sweeping change in the internal life of the country. Even if Alexander had not died so soon, the deep-laid Indian plot was destined to achieve this daring political revolution. This sudden death of Alexander, however, gave Indian political workers an unexpected golden opportunity, and they were quick enough to utilize it for the overthrow of the Greek power. Alexander had left behind Nicanor and Philip as the chief representatives of the Greeks. When the news of Alexander's death reached India, the Indians in the Republic of the Ashwinis suddenly fell upon the Greek governor Philip and assassinated him, along with his small Greek regiment. The second, Nicanor, was also similarly dispatched, and all those monarchies and republics along the banks of the Indus which had acquiesced in the Greek overlordship shook it off at once and proclaimed their independence forthwith. Greek colonies, Greek ensigns and standards, whatever signified the Greek power, was completely destroyed on the spot. The whole of the tract along the banks of the Indus, right from the Panchnath to Sindh, which Alexander had conquered and annexed to his empire, became independent within 6 months of Alexander's death. Alexander had conquered states and countries and empires like Greece, Syria, Persia, Babylon, Egypt, and the like. There he founded Greek cities and Greek colonies, and even after the division of his vast empire, just after his death, his governors and military commanders and their descendants ruled the respective regions like Babylon for centuries together. Even now, in some of those countries exist cities with the name of Alexandria, and Alexander's name is crowned with the title the Great throughout ancient history. But what happened in Bharat? The small states and republics in the farthest corners of India, which Alexander had annexed to his empire under the impression that he had conquered them forever and forever, after fighting incessantly on various battlefields for 2 long years and shedding the blood of millions of Greek and Hindu soldiers, those very Indian states and republics and monarchies literally uprooted his power, his standard, the Greek colonies, and every hateful sign of the Greek victory, and that too within 6 months or at most a year. Even his own name cannot be traced anywhere in Indian history, as if there never was any invasion, any aggression of India's borderlands by any Malay named Alexander. Curiously enough, even no stray reference has yet been discovered in Vedic or Jain or Buddhist ancient literature. Vincent Smith, in his book Early History of India, writes, "All these proceedings prove conclusively that Alexander intended the permanent annexation of those Indian provinces to his empire, but within 3 years of his departure from India, his officers in India were ousted, his garrisons destroyed, and all traces of his rule had disappeared. The colonies which he founded in India, unlike those established elsewhere in the Asiatic provinces, took no root." His campaign, though carefully designed to secure a permanent conquest, was in actual effect no more than a brilliantly successful raid on a gigantic scale which left upon India no mark, save the horrid scars of a bloody war. India remained unchanged. She continued her life of splendid isolation and soon forgot the passing of the Macedonian storm. No Indian author, Hindu, Buddhist, or Jain, makes even the faintest allusion to Alexander or his deeds. So this is the story of Alexander, supposedly the Great, which we have been told, and it also busts the myth of the tale that most of us might have heard, that Alexander conquered the whole world, and then he was sitting and crying that he has nowhere else left to conquer. Well, guess what? He could not even cross the river Vyas. He barely even touched India and he had to leave. So the popular Western narrative that Alexander was this great person and that he was this world conqueror is absolutely rubbish. So please let me know what you think of this episode. If you liked it, send me your comments, your feedback, any suggestions. You can follow me on all the social media platforms. The name is the same, Indologia, Indologia. Don't forget to follow me on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, whichever way you prefer to listen to this. And till the next time I see you, Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.